This is a big room, and we were not provided with any mics, so if you're having trouble hearing us, maybe people in the back just signal, and we'll try to project a little bit more for you. My name is Ella Mahoney. I am an assistant editor at Jacobin Magazine. I'm also on the National Political Committee of the Democratic Socialists of America. And I'm here today with Emily Kummer, who's a high school Spanish teacher in West Virginia, and was a really key organizer in the strikes that happened earlier this year, with Jane McAlevey, who's a longtime labor and community organizer and who's written 2 books on the subject, No Shortcuts, Organizing for Power in the Gilded Age, and Raising Expectations and Raising Hell, on her years in the labor movement and what the labor movement can do better. And also with Eric Blanc, who was a high school teacher in the Bay for 8 years, if I'm correct, is now doing a sociology PhD at NYU and writing for Jacobin, traveling all around the country about the teacher upsurge, which is the topic of our panel today. So, just to introduce a little bit, a lot of labor scholars say that there are sort of, in the history of workers' rights, there are periods of worker upsurge and relative calm, right? And it's in these periods of upsurge that workers make most of their gains and most of the advances that are then become sort of norms in later eras and are preserved for later eras. And it's not easy to predict when these upsurges will happen. I think that there are very few people, except for maybe a few of them in the room tonight, who can honestly say that they predicted the teacher strike wave in 2018 today. But what's really important is for the labor movement and the left to step in and be ready to organize really hard to concretize that momentum into serious gains for workers, into a push for a different status quo, for a different kind of political common sense among people, while that momentum is still going, right? And so that's why it's, I think, really important for us to be talking about what happened in West Virginia, what happened in Colorado, what happened in Arizona, what happened in North Carolina these past few months, because we really ignore it at our own peril, and it's an opportunity that cannot be missed, right? And so going from that, what I'm going to do is really just put these 3 panelists in the hot seat a little bit and ask them some questions about what they think about the upsurge of the past few months, right? And the first one is actually related to why we're calling this an upsurge and not a strike wave. In a recent interview between Eric and Jane really took issue with this word of the strike wave because it makes it sound totally spontaneous and obscures the hard work of organizing and planning that goes into something like this. So I sort of want to first turn to Emily and ask, from what I understand, some of the preparation and planning and organizing for what became this wildcat strike started over a year before the strike, if I'm correct. And I'd just like to hear from you about what that preparation was like, what the goals were, what you guys were doing.
Yeah, so a lot of the early organizing actually happened, I would say, last July. Every year, and it started with healthcare. So every year in West Virginia, for public employees, our insurance, PEIA, the Public Employees Insurance Agency, which covers 1 in 9 West Virginians, has been getting more and more expensive, just like healthcare all around the country. And the way that the unions had been handling that was by basically mobilizing members to show up to these yearly PEIA hearings, where we would go before the PEIA board, which didn't have any kind of power to change laws. It wasn't the legislature. It is this body that makes recommendations to our legislature. But they were organizing us year after year, mobilizing us year after year to show up to these hearings and make a lot of noise, and people would do that. There was good turnout at these hearings. People would get really loud and say, this is how much my deductibles are going up, this is how much my premiums are going up. And then when they were over, nothing would happen. And so there was a core group of us who are pretty like-minded in the Charleston area who recognize this, and a lot of us have been teaching a while. This is my 3rd year teaching, but mostly teachers who finally said, this is not working. We need to be doing real organizing and not just lobbying, basically, because this is what our unions are doing. So we got together, we actually read Jane's book, No Shortcuts, so we, out of that, and kind of reading about, we read the book, looking at these case studies, and also we'd started reading about the teacher strike in Chicago, but we had another strike in mind. In 1990, we had a very successful teacher strike in West Virginia. The result of that was a $5,000 across the board raise. And so we're kind of drawing lessons from that strike, but honestly, until this recent strike, not a lot had been written about the 1990 strike. So anyway, we were drawing all the lessons we could, and we knew basically the goal was we needed to go out and organize people to take on an escalated campaign to win on PEIA, and not just give up after we made a big show at the hearings. So the hearings around the state happened in November. Actually, I believe late October. So we had a few months to kind of get prepared for that. We started a Facebook group, but we did that. There's been a lot of talk about the Facebook group. We started a Facebook group intentionally with the goal of using it for real organizing. So we showed up to the PEIA hearings with clipboards, getting contact information from people, sending out a link and an email to those people to join the Facebook group. And then we were able to kind of identify people around the state and create real connections with them to do further organizing, like plugging them into existing town hall meetings and that sort of thing, where we ended up doing bird dogging and confronting legislators and asking, why are you not funding our health care, which we would then post into the Facebook group and go from there. So all of those things sort of built on each other, and then you saw real on the ground organizing happening in schools, and at that point the unions became involved.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And what do you mean by that? The unions became involved
after the rank and file.
Yeah. So I think that there was the rank and file really lit the spark for real organizing to happen beyond rather than just lobbying, because I think that our unions tend to think, if we just go to the Capitol and we ask nicely, then they'll hear us out and then we'll win. Or I guess, but that's what they think. I don't know. That seemed to be the case, and that was not working. They think in terms of electoral politics. So we just got to vote them all out in November or whatever. But without any kind of real campaign that had energy behind it, even that wasn't going to be realistic. So once it seemed like this energy sort of spread like wildfire across the state, and you saw people, again, posting screenshots of emails they had gotten from legislators, and I think there was kind of like a second, there's kind of another spark, like a second spark that happened around January, and that came actually right after the State of the State address. Our governor announced a 1% raise for public employees. And I remember sitting in my teacher's lounge, and I had not heard anyone talk about politics. And this is my first year teaching at the school where I am now. And I remember I was a little hesitant to kind of bring up politics, but being in a new school, but at first. But after the State of the State address, everyone suddenly was talking about politics, and they said, the governor wants to give us a 1% raise when I can't even, that's not my health insurance, my premium, my deductible, what they're going to go up this year, that's going to eat up the 1% raise and more. This is a joke. And I think if the governor hadn't announced a 1% raise, I'm not sure. I don't know what would have happened, but that was a bit of a catalyst. And then at that point, it caught on across the state, and there was so much energy in the rank and file that the unions were sort of forced to get their act together and do something. And then you started seeing real, they ended up calling for a strike authorization vote, and they started, at the county level, you had county local presidents organizing Red for Ed Day. Like, they didn't call it Red for Ed, but everybody wear red on Friday, and doing walk-ins and that sort of thing. So some of that came from the rank and file. Some of it was there was a working relationship between the rank and file and the union leaders.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And just we've done a lot of panels on this already, but maybe just some basic background information for those who don't know. There are 3 different education unions in West Virginia, right?
Yeah, and that was actually one of the earliest goals of our organizing, was to get and of doing the Facebook group, of all of it, was getting the 3 unions to work together, because we knew that we wouldn't be able to do anything without that. We have 2 teachers unions, AFT and NEA, or WVEA in West Virginia, and we have a 3rd service personnel union, WVSSPA. And any service personnel worker can join AFT or WVEA. Or you can just not be in the union if you don't want to be in the union. So it's a very difficult place. And that can happen in any of the schools. You don't have an AFT school or a WVEA school. It's everyone is everywhere. Mm-hmm. So that's a really difficult environment to organize in, because if one union is on board with a plan to, say, do a walk-in, and the other union isn't, it doesn't, you can conceive of it just not happening. But we were actually really able to kind of organize beyond that. We didn't, I guess just in the early groundwork we were able to lay, we were not thinking of it as one union or the other. We were talking about this in terms of this was a fight for all public employees, and the unions just kind of got behind that fight.
Yeah. I'm curious, do you feel like there was a little bit of a dynamic going on where there was a bit of a vacuum, and whoever sort of actually took the initiative and was making things happen, that became sort of the facts on the ground and how people began to relate to the organizing?
Yeah, for in the early organizing, absolutely. So I think for months, absolutely. Mm-hmm. And then I think that once we were out on strike, I think certainly until we took the actual strike authorization vote, that was the case. And then there was almost a point where it kind of, the union really did step up and did what they needed to do. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And
so for all of you, I guess, this is not always the way that a big strike happens, right? And the kind of preparation that Emily and her colleagues did leading up to it doesn't happen everywhere. Not all of the same things happen in Oklahoma, for example, and there was a different outcome in Oklahoma. Jane, you've seen, I think, many strikes in your lifetime and have seen different outcomes and different kinds of organizing before. What are the sort of takeaways for organizers like Emily about what are the most important things to focus on when you're trying to foster this kind of militant action and really make concrete gains for workers in it?
I'm happy to defer to you on that first. I'm happy to defer to Emily pretty much every minute of the day, but anyway. And then I can.
No, I want to hear what you have to say.
Okay. All right. No,
I've been talking a lot.
Okay. Can we just give Emily a round of applause? it was like her unbelievable strike, right? Like West Virginia is like, let's just discuss West Virginia for a long time. I mean, all the strikes, you know, I mean, whatever, they're all amazing, but there's a lot of particularities about West Virginia that are particularly amazing. So, and I feel like where you were just positing that, there's one thing I genuinely want to ask you though, or just tell me if I'm correct, which is it felt like a key moment, there was a key moment as they were actually building the rank and file base from below, quite strategically. Like I want to go back to the Facebook mention for a minute. That Facebook group was like, first of all, closed, and heavily, I use the wrong words because people who know me know that I suck at social media and I hate it. Not moderated, but like you had to it was invite only, okay? Yeah. So one of the wrong lessons that we're taking away in some of the other states is like Facebook pages where half of Europe, New York, and New York City and Left Forum are members. Like that's not going to tell you the same thing, right? Like so there's a lot of very particular lessons that need to be unpacked from West Virginia, and one is definitely that. It wasn't like, hey, create a Facebook page that says, let's strike. It was very, very different. You mentioned that you were using it to engage real organizing. I just want to highlight that as one place to start.
And I want to point out that we created the Facebook group in October, and we actually looked back and searched within the group for the first time that the word strike was used, and it wasn't until January. We were, you know, we didn't just start a Facebook group and say, let's go on strike. I mean, we were actually working to, we were taking up an escalated campaign to win a demand, and if that meant we have to go out on strike, you know, we knew that that was a possibility, and with our the makeup of our legislature, you know, that could definitely happen, but you know, we were prepared to take it where it needed to go. But I never really actually thought we would go on strike. I knew that it could happen, but yeah.
Yeah. So second thing that I'm sort of asking, and then I want to then I'll get to some point really. But the other, because as I've been having the pleasure of getting to know Emily by telephone. I only met her today. I'm like, I just want to hug her every second. But all of them, like 34,000 people. But part of what seemed like a crucial step too, to sort of force the hand of the what I call position holders. That would be the bureaucratic. I don't call them leaders, I call them the leaders. So the position holders in the unions there were sort of forced to react at some point, and I think that the point of the force was really when the coal counties went out for one day, right? So there was a segue of actions that were taking place, and the one that made it like they couldn't really ignore the traditional union position holders could no longer sort of ignore a lot of rank and file mobilization and organizing that was happening on the ground was when the coal counties, 5 or 6.
The initial walkout was 3, and then there was a 4th county that had a snow day that day, and there are rumors that maybe they really would have walked out if there was nobody really knows, but there are 3 officially, and then I believe 2 weeks later there were 7, so that we had 2 rounds of one-day walkouts in certain counties. The first one 3, the second one 7. The first day was all southern counties. The second day was mostly southern counties, but you had a random northern county and like a couple of other random counties just around the state.
Yeah, so there were these sort of upsurge things happening from the experience of the coal tradition and the coal counties first, and they were doing one days, and I thought it was really beautiful. I can't remember her name now. I was interviewing someone from one of the one days who said to me, like going back to drawing on the history of the state, who said to me, yeah, we thought the one day was really cool, and then I went home, and then my grandfather said to me, what the hell is a one day? You go out to win! And I was like, oh, okay. Anyway, yeah. So, but in terms of like the lesson of like I think part of what I've been just observing from this tremendous work, and a little bit obsessed about, like just with I'm not in West Virginia, though I have been there 100 years, you know, but like, so I've been doing a bunch of interviews, writing some about their incredible work. And so I've interviewed a range of people from superintendents, elected leaders, journalists, mostly a ton of people who were involved in the strike, rank and file leaders, and then also what I call the position holders, sort of all of them. And what I took away so far from some of the interviews are several things. One is that I concluded the first piece I ever wrote, which is in these in a short piece I did for In These Times, right when they won. Like wrote it within an hour and a half of them winning. And I said it took an amazing, genuinely, rank and file movement to start the strikes and to start the big strike, like a statewide, can we just say this again, like 100% out, statewide, 34,000 people out strike. That hasn't happened anywhere else, right? So we just got to keep thinking about things that were West Virginia specific and how do we generalize them? How can we generalize them? But so I say it took the rank and file and some amazing on-the-ground rank and file organizers to get the strike going, to make the strike happen. But I also ended that piece by saying it took a sort of strange alliance or cooperation between the rank and file upsurge and the actual experienced position holders in the three unions to get to settlement and to get to a settlement and a victory, and not have it turn into something. We saw a little less neatness. It wasn't as neat and tidy at settlement time in every state, right? So I think what's interesting and important is I'm looking at the dynamic between the interaction, I'm calling it, between the position holders in the official unions who had experience with negotiations, had relationships and contacts with the legislature, and the particular way in which the rank and file forced accountability onto the position holders, which to me seems crucial and like something that they did very brilliantly. And one example is, which didn't happen in other states, and I think Eric has written very well, by the way, in Jackman about all of this, has been pointing out in some of them, because one thing that the position holders did, given the relationship that they had with the rank and file and the way that you were the strikes were being forced in essence, one thing that happened was the position holders made a decision to call for the statewide strike vote. So that's interesting, right? Because when I talk to folks there, it wasn't like, when I talk about the concept of structure tests and what's a structure test and how do you know when you're ready, the position holders in the state unions are the ones who actually said, okay, it feels like there's 7 strikes have happened in 7 counties, the heat's growing, we have nothing good happening except an exciting movement happening. Let's actually take strike votes school by school across the state, which would give them a real measure of, before we call this thing, are we actually ready, right? So that to me is an important step that didn't happen in some of the other states, I think, in all of the other states, essentially. So this was like, again, the interaction experience of position holders in the unions who had some experience to say, whoa, let's make sure we're ready, right? And when they held the strike votes, and I'll just shut up after this point, because all these early points were so interesting. When they held the strike votes, people like Emily and the people who were leading the rank and file surge from below then stepped back in this dance, this interaction that was going on. They stepped back in and said something else that was going to be super important. One, we're taking it across the schools. So we don't care what union you're in, we're going to hold an industrial vote, which was not what the original plan was. Like, we're going to hold a vote school by school across cooks, bus drivers, teachers, and across the 3 unions. That was led by the brilliant people sitting here and other people that she works with to sort of force the question of industrial model on. The 1990 strike was teachers only. When I interviewed some of the service personnel, they all said to me, we were told by our unions in 1990 and even in the fall of this year that we were not allowed to strike, and we were not allowed to strike at the same time as teachers. So the value of the Facebook group was...
They wanted to.
Yes,
the
value of this closed Facebook group was that they were educating the rest of the workers that actually that just wasn't true, and it wasn't true in 1990. And yes, we can all go out on strike. So there was this, anyway, I think that's one of so many lessons, is that what resulted from a brilliant rank and file movement from below was an all-out, fully industrial model strike where the first time I interviewed one of the school superintendents mid-strike. Virginia is an interesting, smaller state, though now it feels like it looms larger than the whole country to me, but was a superintendent saying to me on the phone, this was like day 5, and I was just cold calling anyone, and half the time they answered. That was fascinating. And this superintendent answered the phone, and I'm like, so I'm a reporter calling from The Nation. It's like fake. I mean, it's not fake, I am, but like that's not why I was calling. But anyway, I was calling, so I was like, why is there no injunction? I kept waiting in a panic for the injunction. Like, what is a legal strike? Like, when's the injunction coming? When's the injunction coming? Will they withstand the injunction? I was sort of panicking as just a organizer in a different state. So when I said to the superintendent in my panic, why is there no legal injunction? and this superintendent, who's a boss, of course, in the strike, said to me, I'll tell you why there's been no injunction, because if just the teachers had gone on strike, we would have just had kickball sessions with the principals, and school would be happening, and there would probably be an injunction by now. But because the bus drivers went on strike in a rural state and there's no one picking up the kids, we actually can't make school work without the bus drivers. And that, to me, is also going unnoticed in the media coverage of the teacher strikes. It was the bus drivers working with the sisters who...
Yeah. I want to let Eric talk. I do. But I want to say really quick.
Keep on talking. I guarantee you whatever you say will be more interesting and insightful. Don't worry about that.
I knew on strike, and I think about it all the time. Like, we won the strike because of the bus drivers and the service personnel, just in general. I mean, we could not have, I don't think we would have won the strike without them. I mean, I don't know how long, I don't know how it could have lasted 9 days. After that critical moment, a lot of people are calling it Dark Wednesday, it was Tuesday that the governor cut a deal with our union presidents for the 5% raise, even though all along our issue was healthcare, and nobody was really even asking for a raise for the most part. People were furious, and we ended up, there's a lot of discussion the next day about whether or not to go back into school. The governor basically said, you're going back into school. Our union presidents told us to go back into school on Thursday, that Wednesday would be a cooling off day. Wednesday, tensions were really high. We were having emergency meetings in every county, and at that point we came to the realization, like, we have to keep fighting. We have to actually fight for this 5% raise, because the Republicans were split on it. Our Republican governor he had made this deal for the 5% raise, but it became clear that our Senate president was going to fight the 5% raise, and he didn't think we should even get that. So the rank and file came together with the union leadership again, and we decided, we're going to fight together, but we're staying out for the 5%. We're not going to go back into school. And we had to fight them on that. But we ended up calling for emergency votes around the state, and we took votes. And of course, we overwhelmingly voted to stay out on strike. And that was probably the most terrifying day of my life, because we were preparing, and we had a meeting with every building rep in the county, and so I was in that meeting, the building rep at my school, and you had the county local presidents of all three unions there, and we were preparing for real picket lines. So if schools are open, we're going to form picket lines, because we were counting on the votes coming in yes. Like, we knew people would vote yes, and so this was the plan for the next day. But where I'm going with this is the president of the service personnel union stood up, and he said, the buses will not run tomorrow. Like, school, you don't have to worry, everyone's freaking out. I'm assuring you right now, you are going to get a call. The buses will not run tomorrow. And it was the most, like, we hadn't gotten the call yet, but it was, I don't know, here, and we heard that really every day, that it was in question whether or not school would be closed the next day. And sure enough.
So this is interesting, because there's actually a little bit of an interesting tension here, between, basically from scratch, you and your fellow organizers were able to build this momentum and incredible rank and file unity that really forced the union leaders to get on board, and for you guys to stay out on an illegal strike when everyone had declared it over, between the legislator and the press and the union leaders, and you were able to achieve this real unity, but not completely effectively be able to push your number one demand and have union leaders, and which was PIA, which was the healthcare, have union leaders, have legislators be prioritizing that as like the number one demand. Why was that? Why was that hard and not so easy to do?
Well, we, the rank and file, was not at the negotiating table. Our union presidents were at the negotiating table, and what they negotiated for was a 5% raise. And so after that deal was cut, it was very difficult to come back from that. We couldn't fight our union leadership and fight the Senate president, who had already come out against the 5% raise at the same time.
And in the lead up, I mean, why in the first place was the leadership going and negotiating principally about the raise instead of PIA?
I think that's a great question. I don't. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's hard to win on healthcare, and I think that ultimately we, healthcare is a national problem, and they I don't know, to win long term, I think the unions are going to have to come together around the country to organize for Medicare for all. Yeah.
Eric, do you want to throw anything into this section?
Jane, go first, and then I'll add something.
Okay, awesome. Thanks. The thing that I was, again, this is the outside the state view, and I love to do it sitting right next to Emily. But another thing that I have been sort of thinking about, and that I sort of wrote about, I think this is with my hat on as having been, including recently again, a chief negotiator in big contract fights and big union fights and strikes. So part of what I was afraid of, again, I was confessing to Emily today how many nights of sleep I lost over every day of their strike, just freaking out, as I'm sure many of us were, collectively on behalf of this entire struggle going on in West Virginia. So one thing that I from having negotiated contracts, one thing that I thought, sitting very far away from the day that was happening, when you were all debating, let's defy it, let's stay out. But in the early stages of it, there was a lot of pushback saying, the slogan was, a freeze is not a fix. Because it wasn't just a 5% raise, right? They killed the voucher schools. There were actually a lot of things. They killed a move to go for charter schools in the state. They also killed imposition to take away seniority in school. There were many other victories, and I hope none of us keep talking only about the 5%, because it diminishes the many other things that you won in this fight, including stopping charter schools, which, by the way, is a big deal. So one, there were other victories. Two, but in that moment, there was the 5%, because they had already done that. They already killed 3 pieces of bad legislation already, right around charter schools, taking seniority away, and taking away union official time business or something. So 3 wins, 2 of which really mattered a lot from a left view or the view of good schools. And then, but the other one that happened on the night that deal was cut was that a task force was set up on healthcare, on PEIA. So there was sort of an initial position that, there was a chant coming out from a lot of people saying a freeze is not a fix. The whole issue was driving towards a solution on healthcare. But I do have to say that from my experience, trying to get to settlement in very complicated contracts, that the hardest thing to settle, in my experience, generally in this country, is healthcare. Sometimes pensions, healthcare and pensions. Looking at other people in this room who also organize and strike and negotiate. But so I was sitting very far away in California, playing the role of just writing for The Nation or writing for the New York Times and just writing and thinking, I was kind of panicking when you were defying the leadership. I began to panic, let's not, what's this expression? Let's not steal victory from the jaws, create defeat from victory or something, right? Yeah. Because it's hard as hell to figure out how to even tweak a healthcare plan when you're actually at the table in negotiations. It's my least favorite subject as a negotiator, frankly. So it's complicated. It takes a lot to do. I didn't think that no matter how many days they stayed on strike, they could actually force a raising of corporate taxes while on strike. To get to the win that they need to get to, it's now, and it gets to another big question you're asking that you sort of asked earlier, which is what do we do? What are the lessons we're learning from this? The lessons are, it's hard as hell, and now we have to sustain the victory big enough to deliver a win on this intermediate task force that was established. Looking from far away, I thought the task force establishment, of course, wasn't winning on insurance, but just from a practical experience negotiating, I thought the task force wasn't a bad alternative. It gives you all a way to keep mobilizing and organizing and engaging people, and it lets you fight and rebuild resources from the inside of the classroom before you maybe have to go back. So there were a lot of things that I thought were beneficial about it. Now the problem with that is the progressives weren't the ones designing that task force. So the problem itself is that the task force itself is stacked with a bunch of corporate hacks. So there are other problems created by the task force, but part of the beauty of it is the fight in West Virginia, in fact, is still going, and it's going hard, because now you're coming back to win an increase in progressive taxes. But I think that it wasn't a bad idea to come off, for that reason, to come off the lines and get back into the schools, recharge, because I don't know if you could hold people for months on end. Like 100% out strike from, it was already amazing.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's okay. Back to you.
So first of all, I would just say that it is entirely correct that both of you have been speaking the whole time, because you both led mass strikes, and I have written about a few of them. So this is like, that's good. I'll just add a few.
Mass strike. But
Yeah. I'll just talk a little bit about, as a point of comparison, Oklahoma and Arizona, because there's a tendency, I think, to somewhat conflate the strike waves in the states and assuming that the organizing dynamics are the same. And in fact, they're quite different, and we can learn by that variation. And I think that the easiest way to think about it as an entry point is that West Virginia and Arizona were clear victories, and Oklahoma was at least experienced by most rank and filers as not a clear victory, and some people felt it was a defeat. I think they actually won important gains as far as pay, but the way it was felt and the level of organization was much lower. And so the question is, why was that? What led to that divergence? And I think that part of it has to do with exactly what Emily and Jane were talking about, is that the organizing that went into West Virginia and in Arizona was very political, strategic. It was not this spontaneous, just upsurge. This was because there were solid organizers on the ground with clear politics, with class politics, and with organizing experience that were helping lead these strikes. And so in Oklahoma, that layer didn't exist. And so what that meant in practice is that even though the amount of anger was just as strong, in some ways the conditions in Oklahoma schools are actually worse than West Virginia, like as far as per pupil funding. All of that, the conditions are actually more catastrophic. The anger and the mobilization was just as strong. But the organizers didn't do build-up actions, they didn't do workplace votes, and so they didn't have that sort of organizational capacity either from the union or from the rank and file to both sustain the strike or to organize a wildcat. And part of that meant that they didn't get as far as in their demands that they want. And in some ways, I think that the big thing that didn't happen, which we did see positively in West Virginia and Arizona, was that the big end of the strike a lot of times is that workers build self-confidence, they build organization, right? And so you come out from a strike hopefully able to fight for more, right? And that's what, to a certain extent, didn't happen in Oklahoma. Arizona, I feel like we actually should talk more about Arizona. West Virginia is amazing. Arizona is also amazing because the conditions there were more difficult in some ways. There's not a living labor tradition there. There is not people, because the anecdote that kept on getting brought up in West Virginia is like, my daddy told me you never cross a picket line, right? Like people would say that.
And you stay out until you win.
And you stay out until you win. I didn't hear that once in Arizona. Like it was not the thing, right? In Arizona, as you know, it's a bastion of the right wing. It is the far right against immigrants. It's also the center of charters. Right? So you have a quarter, it's the highest percent of charters in the whole country. You have a quarter of the schools in charters, which means that it's much harder for those teachers to organize because they're terrified of getting fired at any moment. And so the fact that they were able to pull off what they did in Arizona is fucking amazing. And what that was both important gains as far as what they won from the state, but their level of organization, I would argue, from below, it's in some ways parallels or even it goes further in West Virginia to a certain extent. Right now, there's 2,000 site liaisons, which is basically every school site has designated organizers that both organized the strike, did the strike votes, and this was initiated by the rank and file. It wasn't initiated by the union because the union there was much weaker. West Virginia's unions were actually relatively strong, which people miss. In Arizona, the unions were very weak, had 20% of the membership. The rank and file group by the strike had 60 to 70% of the schools organized. It's like pretty remarkable. And so what they came out of the strike was not just important wins as far as the state, but a huge organizational apparatus. So much so that the weekend after they ended their strike, they had mass organizing meetings across the state to figure out their next step. And they already had a plan, which was to pivot towards progressive taxation. And so I think that like that level of organizing perspective exists very much in Arizona, and it's exciting. So maybe we can talk about it, but they're doing a initiative in the November ballot to win the last funding that wasn't won in the strikes. And it goes to some of these questions that the deep funding is harder to win. The pay increases have been won in all states, but getting like these big, it requires more. And so what they did, and I think this can be replicated elsewhere, and I think it would be useful to really try to hammer on this point, is a ballot initiative to raise the funds for school by taxing the 1%, literally the 1% of income earners. And it's both a great organizing tool because they're lost no momentum organizationally. They're just as mobilized after their strike as they were before, which is pretty hard to do. And it raises the question of class versus class. Who should pay for the crisis? So I think that like looking at Arizona in particular also merits further discussion because the conditions aren't, we're not always going to have like the coal mine, the miner to do walkouts that we can lean off of. So and sometimes we have to create those conditions more than we can lean on the traditions.
Yeah, and the two states that have the highest level of rank and file organization are the two states where the struggle is continuing and where they're directly going after progressive taxation. So that says something about spontaneity versus actual rank and file organizers on the ground organizing and building in a way that's going to continue the struggle, let them grow, and challenge the corporate class in a direct way.
Right. And another thing that's sort of treated as spontaneous and impossible to explain and maybe magical or mysterious in some way is that most of these strikes, or all of these strikes, have happened in red states with actually very low union densities, even kind of catastrophic union situations like in Arizona. Why is that these really haven't occurred in blue states with really sophisticated union structures, high union densities, friendly political scenarios? Why is that? Any of you can jump in.
For that.
Oh, you want to go first?
You go first. I'll yeah.
You go first.
Okay.
You go first. Now I'll go second.
Okay. I just go for it. I'll go after, and then I'll pick it back.
Okay. So one thing I'm not sure. Well, I think there's several things that help explain it, and I don't know that it's the ones that have been talked about most actually, except in some of Eric's articles maybe. But one thing I've been thinking a lot about, which I was just talking today with Emily about, is there's some analogy like in the world of union organizing. We reference two different kinds of concepts. I mean, there's a million concepts, okay, but I'm just being simple here for a minute. There's what we call hot shop organizing, and then there's like strategic organizing. Let me just say there's two different concepts, and there's a lot in between. But in some ways, I'm starting to think about the current strikes, the upsurge happening in these states as similar to like a hot shop strike and hot shop organizing, by which I mean what hot shop organizing refers to generally, and I'm sorry if everyone knows this already, is like basically workers are pissed off, something horrible happens, the boss is a total asshole to them, I say he usually, anyway, just cut back everything, taken away huge cuts to them, fired them all, rehired them, whatever, right? Bad things are happening. Cuts to vacation plans, cuts to health care, and workers are uniformly pissed and are all going to quit soon anyway if they don't actually do something. So they decide, let's form a union. And it's a hot shop because everyone's equally pissed. People vote yes for the union. It seems like a great thing. Then the boss closes up because they're bankrupt and leaves town because they're actually incompetently run, or they're just a broke employer, or it's an employer without a lot of money. And so there's a whole dynamic of a lot of hot shop organizing going on in the US. Unfortunately, a bunch of people ruined the concept in some ways of strategic organizing, but it's a different story. So when I think about the part of why they're happening under very difficult conditions like a hot shop. They're like hot states. They're the states with 47th, 48th, 49th, whatever it is, in lowest pay. And basically lots of quotes are coming from teachers in the strike saying, look, I don't give a shit. I'm going to go on strike because I'm just going to go get a job at a McDonald's tomorrow if not. Like, in some ways there's an analogy to like, it's also like winning in Greece, like don't take over Greece anymore. Like we want to win where there's a state with money. Like you want to win with a boss across the table who has money to spend. So there's something interesting about the worst conditions producing the strikes that are also not clear where they're going, right? That's what's making me nervous. Right now, except in West Virginia and Arizona, where there's actually ongoing organization and a plan, one. And then two, I think, first of all, the strike wave begins in Chicago, So that's a blue state with a sophisticated union. Like really where a lot of this work begins in the Chicago Teachers Union and the strike there. That's a blue state. I think some impetus around the country from some of the progressive or left dialogue going on also then comes from Massachusetts, where the teachers union, at least top position holder technically, but actually in her case a leader, won there, and they defeated the charter schools. Like there's been a growing dialogue going on among teachers in a bunch of forums. And education workers in general, and I think we're going to see. There's potentially going to be the next big strike will potentially be happening in Los Angeles, right? Depending on if they get a contract or not. So, but I think the larger question you're asking is somewhat having to do with how easy or hard it is for the rank and file to create an upsurge in a state where they have a more sophisticated union who can actually keep them down. It's part of the equation. So in the states where we have, in a blue state where you have seen strikes, it's when the progressives have taken over the union. And that's usually the first fight. So first the progressives take over the union, and then you see a strike. So that's, the challenge is different. It's almost like in the states with a very weak union structure, the rank and file can actually lead in some ways much more easily and catch the union position holders off guard and force them into action that they may not have done. In states with a much more sophisticated staff and people who are being told what to do, it may be harder. So test one becomes not the strike. Test one becomes people taking control of the union and then actually, like in Chicago, and then actually having the strike.
Yeah, so I agree 100% with what you said, Jane. I'll add a few points. One is that it's clear that the level of just like material distress of teachers was very strong. So that's a factor. It's not every state's like that. That being said, it's interesting. Like, does anyone here know what the 50th state in pay is? It's Mississippi. So why didn't Mississippi go on strikes? No, it's interesting, right? So it's not just bad conditions,
Absolutely.
right? Because it's also the case that if that were true, one would have expected there to be all of these states had strikes. So there is the question of organizers having taken the initiative. So it's both conditions and organizers. That being said, the conditions were different. So you laid out some of them. The union leadership was weaker. The Democrats were out of power. I mean, it's part of the dynamic there was that the types of like moderating forces on the left, more or less, that serve in a lot of blue state, quote unquote blue states, to prevent strikes or things like that, were much weaker, and they were sort of out of power in a way. They'd been iced out, and the union leaderships had been iced out. They had lost their, like in West Virginia, right? You can talk about it. But the union leadership used to have this cozy deal as long as the Democrats were in power for 80 years, right? And then all of a sudden, Republicans in 2014 take over, and they have no mechanism through which they can do their old style. And so what that meant in practice is one of the reasons why the union leaderships, like, to their credit, went along with the walkouts. They didn't try to stop them generally. But that's different in a place like New York or California, to say the least. And there's another aspect that's important. It gets a little overstated, but one of the important dynamics was that these were statewide strikes, which part of that is because the pay structure in most of the states, not all, is statewide as opposed to district level. In a lot of states, the district is the primary funder. So interesting, there was one, do you know, there was one state that didn't have the statewide pay, and that was Arizona. And they made a political decision, to their credit, to go after this. They said, we're going to do it like West Virginia. Even though we could do state, like district by district, we're going to go after the state because that's how we're going to be united and we're going to win. So they ignored the existing framework that was set up for them to collectively struggle, not exactly collectively bargain, but more or less that's who the natural boss might have appeared to be. And I think that raises a question that I know you've raised a lot, which is sometimes you have to break the law, or you have to break the structures that are set up for you. And that, I think, put that into sharp relief. I'll leave it at that.
I mean, so in the last time that you were here in New York, Emily, one of the speakers at the talk talked about how you guys in West Virginia were able to sort of vault over the union in order to get it to do the things that you wanted it to do, right? Whereas, organizers in Chicago, in other cities, focused, like Jane talked about, on creating caucuses, trying to take over the union, trying to reform it that way, right? You guys were sort of able to vault over the structures and just organize yourself, right? And that is what allowed for such an incredible sort of movement moment to happen. But there are also some disadvantages, I think, which is that you don't have this like ready-made organization left to you after the strike necessarily. And so how are you guys dealing with that now? With, you know, the strike's over, you have a much higher member engagement, people are much more politicized and involved, but you still have these 3 unions that people are split up into. You don't necessarily have a ready-made, like, super strong organization for you to continue the fights that you need to continue with.
Yeah, well, we managed to build an informal network in the process of going on strike.
Yeah.
You know, and in the lead up to the strike, being out on strike, a network around the state kind of cohered. And, you know, we were keeping in contact with each other. That kind of came out of the Facebook group, but it also came out of just people knowing each other across the state. And we actually, several people from across the state met up in Charleston a couple of weeks ago to talk about next steps. And that's going to continue happening. So it'll be really, it's really exciting to see that happen, and it'll be really exciting to see how that plays out in the future in the fight for PEIA.
Right.
Yeah, and I think it'll be really necessary to have that kind of structure where workers from all different unions can come together around that, you know, those same goals.
And what is the focus of that organizing now? Is it PIA? Is it more electoral, like a Remember in November kind of thing?
Not at all.
No.
No. I think our union leadership is pretty focused on the election, but no, we are our goals are progressive taxation. So we're looking at 2 taxes. The natural gas severance tax and the corporate net income tax, which was lowered in 2007 under Democratic leadership. Joe Manchin was actually our governor at the time, and he lowered the corporate net income tax from 9% to 6.5%, and that was supposed to bring in jobs. But anyone living in West Virginia knows that has not happened. So that's actually, you know, when we've been talking to people about this tax that's been really, really popular, both of those taxes have been popular. People are really getting behind that. And that I don't think that would have happened before the strike. So yeah, we were pushing for those because we don't want this funding to come from working class people.
Right.
Yeah.
Eric, you mentioned a little bit about this before, but is that what you saw people converging around in other states as well as the next step in their organizing in Oklahoma and Arizona, North Carolina?
Yeah. So, there's this ballot initiative. There's actually 2 ballot initiatives in Arizona. The other is against charters, which is really, and vouchers in particular, actually. They're trying to do a massive expansion. And so the November ballot in Arizona, unlike a lot of states, there's going to be space on there to, I think, organize in a way that is different than just your average get out the vote for liberal Democrat who will probably, at best, ignore you and at worst, betray you, right? And so that the dynamic there, and again, that was because I think in some ways the hardest part of organizing is the next step after a struggle and how you sustain that. And to their credit, they were thinking about that before. And I think that's a lesson perhaps for other organizers too, is to already start thinking while you're engaged in struggle, where are you going from there? Because it's not easy to sustain. And so it's going to be a challenge. I'd be interested in how you look at that in the organizing you've done, because I think that's the challenge, in everywhere. But even in Arizona, that people want to go back to regular life a lot of times, right? And so I don't know what are the mechanisms or ways that you can try to keep up energy. It's not so obvious.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
Well, I was going to say one of the things we are looking ahead. One of the things we are talking about, we do have an election coming up in November, and I certainly don't think we should be focusing on electoral politics, but we also can't ignore the election, and I think that we can use the election strategically to hold those running for office accountable. So you have a lot of Democrats that have been endorsed by the unions, and I think that we can hold those those politicians accountable and ask them, on the record, do you support raising these taxes, and using that as leverage to win on these taxes. So people have been talking about that quite a bit.
Jane, did you want to add anything?
Just briefly, I think about this more, the comment I'm about to make more came from looking at the North Carolina situation recently, where, they were able to pull off a one-day massive, right, 30,000, basically 35,000 out for a day. It was planned to be a day. As far as I can tell, again, from far away, the relationship there is much more, in each of these states, part of what is interesting is, again, this interaction between the existing position holders who are full-time staff with some resources in these state unions and the rank and file upsurge. Arizona, it's the best relationship, and we're seeing good things in Arizona where the state union leadership is like, let's go. Janice is coming. Hey, someone figured out how to get people out in the street. Wasn't them, so that was good. It's great. West Virginia, not quite as simple. North Carolina, Oklahoma, really contentious, like straight hostility coming from the state position holders. So, for example, in North Carolina, it took a lot for the rank and file folks from below to actually get to that 35,000 out. They were sort of actually outmaneuvering from below in a very sophisticated way through not at all just Facebook, actually, just like mouthed phone calls, old-fashioned. People driving around because there was so much pushback happening about how they engineered to get personal networks going. They set up a Facebook group per district. They couldn't even figure out how to do it statewide without it getting infiltrated, so they had little nodes of Facebook groups being set up to teach the workers how to request the day off, because contractually they're all guaranteed a day off. And if they got to a critical mass of days off, of the same teachers requesting the same day off to the superintendents were sort of being forced to just say, well, there's not enough substitutes, we can't do this, right? So, but it's a very contentious relationship. And in North Carolina, all they want to do in the official union nationally and statewide position holders, bureaucracy, is demand that, crush this energy and demand that it's all about electing Democrats in November. Now, if you're a grassroots rank and file organizer in a state with a lot of conservative people, the idea that what you would do is stand up and say, let's go elect Democrats, is about the stupidest thing I've ever heard. So, which is very normal, by the way. You know what I mean? It's normal. That doesn't mean it's not, there's a ratio to stupidity there. But so, it's particularly stupid coming in as Janice is coming, right? Where what you need is 30,000 people who are suddenly excited about a union that they've never paid dues to, coming out on the streets, being told in a state where many of the rank and file members will be either independent or Republican, or Democrat, right? It's to have the answer be, and you could see it right away. The right-wing governor and the right-wing legislative leaders immediately stood up and said, oh, this whole thing is a sham for the Democratic Party. So it was it fell right into their trap. And so it was triply stupid. So what I like about Arizona and West Virginia, again, different solutions, PEIA fight, take the fight to this commission. They've got an organizing handle and a way to keep going, to call for progressive taxation. And then it's not, the November conclusion in Arizona is not let's go elect Democrats, thank effing God. It's let's go enact our own ballot initiative that in fact will be a solution if we can win it. It's not let's go sell ourselves out to a useless party that's been taken over by Wall Street and as every bit as guilty in the charter school and destruction of teachers' unions and teachers and the education system as most ours, as was the Manchin governor in your state, who's the lovely Senate Democrat now, whatever, So the solutions are not about even if there's an electoral solution, ballot initiative, great electoral solution. That gives them an organizing handle, but it's a win. It's also going to test, it's a structure test for them. Can they do it? It's going to be hard as hell.
It's going to be super hard.
Hard as hell. They got the Koch brothers bankrolling the campaign against them. It's going to be a super hard test in Arizona. But it's not about It's not about November as let's go get the Democrats. It's not in either of these states, as you can tell. It's November with the ballot initiative, and we're coming for progressive taxation on the ballot. Like, way easier to mobilize for that, way better strategy. Can't do it in every state, right?
Yeah.
So you can't do
We
it.
don't
Like,
have ballot
can't do it in New
initiatives in West
York, can't do it in
Virginia.
West, can't do, this is the most corrupt political, anyway. You can't do a ballot initiative in New York, for God's sakes. But, so that, yeah.
You can do it in California.
Yeah, of course.
We did.
Do, of course.
Right. I mean, it's kind of amazing after West Virginia when we see a Republican-dominated legislature basically bend to the wishes of teachers and rule out charter schools and all of their earlier plans, give a raise, and obviously the makeup of a legislature matters, but not as much as people think it does if you have a strong and mobilized workers movement able to demand these things. So it's kind of incredible that the lesson anyone would take from this is that we need to elect more Democrats and return to that. Yeah. But I have a couple of other questions, and then we're gonna move to some questions from the audience. One, I wanted to get to sort of what the lessons for the left are, but before that, I just have one small last question for Emily about we've talked about how one of the keys for success in this strike was that you were organizing on an industrial basis, basically, that bus drivers were involved, that service personnel were involved. Is it going to be possible to continue doing that, around the fights with PIA and progressive taxation? Is there sort of room for almost more like a public sector worker movement?
Oh yeah, I think it's more possible. I think it's there is more opportunity to keep doing that. I think there are more people to involve in this fight now that we are, our hopes were to be. Organizing for. We were organizing for PEIA altogether. We ended up getting a raise for all. We actually, we got a 5% raise for all public employees in the state of West Virginia. I think that's something a lot of people don't realize. We didn't get a 5% raise for teachers and school service personnel. We got a 5% raise for every state employee in West Virginia. So my dad got a raise, my sister got a raise, I got a raise.
Did they thank you? Did they?
Yes.
Did they thank you?
One industrial all-out strike gives the whole state a raise.
Yeah.
Strikes.
They do not work in schools. But so anyway, I think that opens up. We have a lot of public employees in the state of West Virginia. And so I think that really that opens up who we can bring into the fight, and it also helps with public opinion. Everybody in West Virginia knows somebody who works for the state of West Virginia, right? This is a fight that's really close to home. Everybody knows somebody who is on PEIA, or maybe they grew up on PEIA. It's going to be easier to involve, in a way, it's going to be easier to involve other public employees in the fight, although there was this sense, there are challenges, there was this sense in the lead up to the strike that teachers and school employees are allowed to go on strike, but other state workers aren't allowed to go on strike. And I think that part of that is because our unions are stronger. Another part of that is, there was this precedent in 1990 where we had this successful strike, but I don't want to get my dates wrong, but I believe in the 60s there was a strike of state workers where our governor at the time, Arch Moore, fired a bunch of them. And so our histories there are a little different. So there's a precedent of state workers getting fired for walking off of the job. It was like, I believe it was like 2,000. There were like 2,000 workers fired. There's a question that a lot of us are talking about is, how great would it be, for another state agency to go out, but I don't quite know how to do that, but I would love for that to happen.
Well, you've set an example now. You've made something of a model at this point. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And yeah, so I mean, as I said before, I'm a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, and these strikes are really exciting because it's easy to see them as chances to get people thinking about something like progressive taxation. What should our priorities be as a society? Who should be paying for those priorities? In a way that's really, really directly related to the needs of working people and what people are going through in their schools, in their communities. And it's an amazing example of people standing up and collectively demanding those things themselves. It's not some like hotshot revolutionary like storming, doing it themselves. And so I'm curious what the people at this table think about what are the lessons for the sort of political left and not just the labor movement that should be taken away from these strikes, from this movement.
Should I go? I'll go first. Yeah, so that's a huge question. I'll
Sorry.
The lessons, yeah. What I would say is a couple things. The left, for at least since the 50s, and McCarthyism has been divorced from our class in this country, right? Like we were forcibly divorced. What is there a word for that? Right? We were separated, and we've had a hard time rebuilding those links. We've tried in the 60s, 70s with various degrees of success, but today we should just be honest. Like part of the weakness of both the left and the labor movement, I think, is this disconnect. And it's the really simple arguments, I think, need to be made over and over and over and over again. First of all, just like the working class is still a thing, it still exists. It still is the most important thing that exists as far as our ability to make progressive change. Right. Strikes are so important it's our biggest weapon. And if we can make that case I'm really excited about the DSA, and there's other groups like ISO that are growing, to a young generation that is looking to Bernie Sanders. A lot of the people who were leading these strikes first got politicized through the Bernie Sanders campaign, right? They got politicized, and they're looking at socialism, they're challenging capitalism. And for that layer, I think the argument for us who have a little bit more experience on the left is we'd be like, yeah, get a teacher's job, get a job in healthcare. You can organize on a similar basis. It's not going to be as easy. It's not just going to be like Facebook group 3 months strike. We need to like steal people, and this is going to be a long process, right? Of years, decades. But I think, to my mind, that's the big argument I would make, particularly to young people, is like, look at the labor movement as our place to be. Look at trying to get a job where you can do workplace organizing. And if we do that, if we can get a big chunk of DSAers and other lefties to do that, particularly in younger, but not just, I think that we have chances to rebuild the labor movement that we haven't seen for decades. So I'm really excited about that.
Yeah. I think one of the things for me, I talked to a lot of people from outside of West Virginia who were watching our strike from the outside, thinking like, oh, West Virginia is this place that's just like filled with a bunch of radicals who are like, the capital is just like filled with radicals. What's happening here? And how did this happen in a place that voted for Donald Trump? I didn't know there were all these radicals here. It's just like so wrong, like insane. It's like, what? But I think because, we did have people in West Virginia with, the kind of politics that, we were pushing for progressive taxes from the very beginning, and we were able to say, like, we do not want this, we do not want our healthcare or our raise funded on the backs of poor people. We were able to get that message out in the forefront. We were able to propel that, and it caught on, and now just regular working class people are saying that, and are fighting for that now. So people were politicized in that way very quickly, and I don't know, I watched it happen in real time. It's not that they're all of a sudden radicals, but that's never going to happen. But I don't know. There's a lot can happen in a very short span of time if you have people who are kind of getting that message out strategically.
Just on this socialism question, well, the first thing I wrote was, if you can't organize a strike, you can't take the state. So I think it actually, like, it's so totally seconding everything that you guys said. I just think that part of what we have to get better at, and the we is whatever a sort of self-described left is that sort of like debating theory less and doing it more. And actually getting out into the field and figuring out, is anything that you're writing about or talking about actually translatable into action? There's far too little of it, and it's quite hard, and sustaining it's quite hard. So yeah, what I want from everyone I know who's a socialist is to do more socialism and talk less about it. Serious.
Yeah, I would just echo what all three of you said, especially I think that there's been a really historic cleavage between the left and labor. That's not entirely the left's fault, but some of it was under its control, and not enough people chose to rectify it, right? I think that's part of what, has produced this confusion around a place like West Virginia, looking at people who maybe voted for Donald Trump and not being able to understand how they could go on strike and demand progressive taxation and to be involved in this incredible collective action, right? And that paralysis has really prevented people from doing something like going and taking a rank and file job as a teacher, and organizing people based on where they are and where their interests lie, and moving from there, and because we really have this idea that people's political ideology is fixed and that nobody can learn through experience, right? And I think that that's something that we have to really fight hard against, and be willing to get in there and to talk to people, and to organize in this way, because we really can't expect people to move if we're not willing to move with them, right? Yeah, on that note, I think how much time do we have left? Oh, really? We have half an hour? Yeah. Wow. Okay. So if you have a question, how about you up right here?
Ella, we're thinking take 3 questions at a time.
Okay, sure. We're going to do 3 at a time. So we have a scarf here, and cake, and bearded guy.
So, thank you for great experience, great panel. I have learned so much. I've been involved here at the Student Workers Union, and I'm very interested about the relation between the union, the position holders, as Jane says, and the rank and file. And you said that basically the rank and file forced industry vote. And I'm very interested in how did you do it if you had a kind of hostile leadership, like the technicality of it. How can you bypass, the position holders?
I wanted to ask, what you guys think about the recent Supreme Court cases that are dealing with labor and what the effect of that will be on the movement going forward? And not just Janus, but the last 2 recent court decisions about the one about lawsuits and and I guess it was an executive order about
executive orders. It was a bad read through last week.
Yeah. So that also.
Yeah. My name is Seth. I'm a transit worker. I'm a subway driver. Also a supporter of a group called the League for the Revolutionary Party. A couple of us transit workers went down to support the West Virginia strike. I think we got there on the Sunday and were there for the Monday towards the end. It was really inspiring. I just wanted to give my thanks because, I've been doing organizing for years inside my union, Local 100, and it's a tough slog. And to have a strike that won in such a great way, so many things, is a real shot in the arm. I wanted to maybe sort of connect up some of the lessons there to stuff that goes on, like in my union in New York City. In particular, the 2 things that really strike me as so important are that the union bureaucrats there were behind the strike to some degree and then tried to cut a deal early, and the rank and file cut that off and voted against it and organized, and I thought that's amazing. In my union in '05, if people remember, we had this, New York City was shut down, and our leader, Roger Toussaint, brought Local 100 back from the strike after 2.5 days without a deal. He had come out of a rank and file movement called New Directions, which was supported by leftists. Came back without a deal. When the deal came out, members voted it down. He called for a revote on it, and the backlash for that basically shattered the union to this day, where I can talk to people and they're like, F that, I'm never going on strike again. We're very weak now, unfortunately, because of that. And so taking that lesson of what you guys did and being able to say, no to what the union leaders made the deal is like huge. That was the first thing. And then the second thing being that you want to demand for all state workers. Like, it's huge. Yeah. We in the union, one of the things that I've been trying to do is raise motions to get my union involved in other struggles of the working class. Like, try to get, my union's mostly Black and Latino, getting the union involved in Black Lives Matter. I tried to raise a motion to get a union march down to Washington during the attack on healthcare that would affect other workers. And so, but it was shut down by the union leaders. So I just wanted to say, again, that's like a huge example, and to thank you for that. And so just two quick questions. One question was with respect to the issue of, like, I think ballot initiatives are a good way forward, but also it sidesteps the idea of workers needing their own party, right? If we agree that the two parties don't really work for us. So the idea of, is anything being brought up with the idea of teachers running as workers on their own without independent of either of the parties, or forming something like a workers' party? And then the other question.
I think we're going to keep it to one question.
Okay, well, that's fine.
So you guys can tackle whichever ones speak to you.
You guys first.
Okay, so the first question was, how did we a statewide authorization vote? So basically, we didn't explicitly. I don't think there was a moment where we all came together and formally said, okay, we want a statewide authorization vote. But I think it became clear that there were so many people saying, we want to go on strike, we want to go on strike, we want to go on strike. And that was coming from left and right all over the state. And teachers and school service personnel, especially in the southern counties, were already making moves to organize one-day walkouts. And we were having these emergency meetings. We were around the state. We were calling for votes, but we weren't calling for necessarily a statewide vote. It was more happening at the county level. So we were having emergency meetings, and we were calling the union and asking, hey, what's happening? Are we going on strike? It looks like we need to go on strike. So I think at a certain point it became clear to the union that this was going to happen whether they let it or not. And in the southern counties it did. We, at the emergency meetings that we had at the county level, the one I went to in Kanawha County, the union leadership, basically they told us, this is what's going to happen. These are all the reasons that it could go wrong. And it's my understanding that when they had those meetings in the southern counties, the rooms were packed, every employee in the county was there, and they basically said, we don't care, we're going out anyway. And the leadership didn't really have a choice but to lead them. And so after the one-day walkout, the first one-day walkout, the whole state, the momentum spread across the state, and it grew so big, and there was so much demand from the rank and file, from the ground up, that I think it just would have happened anyway, whether they called for it or not, or it would have happened county by county, and it would not have been well organized. And I think that the union leadership didn't want a disorganized strike, and they were smart enough to lead it well and to do it the right way and call for the vote. Yeah.
You agree with that?
I do, but who the hell am I? That's your question.
I mean, you're looking at
No, I'm like, no,
Yeah.
I know that. Well, that was the thing I was
my
saying.
theory.
Yeah, right. But that's the thing. I mean, that is the interesting interaction thing.
Yeah.
Like, and then it goes a little bit to your point too. But I mean, you know, sort of note to selves, like if you can organize the rank and file out from underneath the leadership, you can probably get a lot done. So, but if you're just wishing that will happen, it's not going to work. Like they actually built a rank and file organization from below and began to test it and began to do real things that made it obvious that there was either something that was going to look more like a wildcat happen or something like let's get on board and actually harvest this thing and have a statewide strike. Though where those position holders wanted it to go, where they wanted to take it was, I would say, different then, right? I think they were, depending on their different unions too, but some of them were hoping, going back, connecting the Supreme Court question, some of them were hoping like, oh, well, hey, Janice, you know, what, look at that. I think when I was doing interviews with a lot of the position holders in a lot of the states, they were sort of like, we never figured out how to get 30,000, 50,000, 75,000 people on the street. You know, so they're at least sort of paying attention at a moment when the Supreme Court is about to really make it even harder. Like, let's harness it, which doesn't mean let's enable it. It doesn't mean let's continue it. You know what I mean? So there's something quite nerve-wracking and nervous-making about
But
it.
if it's going to happen, we might as well channel it into a positive direction.
Yeah. So on the, I just wanted to, I mean, the Supreme Court decisions are all horrific. They're all awful. For people who missed it, there was one called Murphy Oil last week that was coming for a long time that is getting much less attention than the Janus case. And the Murphy Oil case in some ways is more devastating, like from an ordinary worker's perspective, maybe, than the Janus. So they're being driven by the same evil forces. But Murphy Oil, what's so interesting about the decision that came down last week, which essentially says, we already knew this, but they codified the idea that workers are just like a product. We're like cell phones. We're like, every worker in the country in the United States now can be forced, if you don't have a union. That's what I think is interesting about it. Like there's an opening that's interesting. Like if you don't have a union, every worker in the country can now be forced into binding arbitration agreements, individual binding arbitration that you have to sign when you start your job, just like the 4-point font thing you get from the washing and dryer company or your cell phone, or like, so very dangerous. They're even if you think about the sexual harassment in the sort of Me Too moment, like it's unbelievable timing for me. Like as women are starting to, mostly in not union workplaces, because mostly workers aren't in union workplaces in the United States. So there are, women all over the place. They begin to find out carefully, oh, I've been harassed. Oh, that same asshole did the same thing to you. Like that takes a while. They figure it out, collective action. Oh, class action lawsuit. Like they used to, if they didn't have a union, they could have teamed up and found some. No, now it's binding arbitration agreements individually. Like it's a super anti-worker decision that the U.S. Supreme Court put through last week that didn't get much attention, is still not getting much attention, because sadly, I think, frustratingly and sadly, it's a reflection of what's most concerning to most of the national trade unions, which is their dues, not whether or not there's individual binding arbitration being mandated on people or not. Plus, it's like missing a huge moment. Like the National Labor Movement should have last week been out like on a giant message that said, the only way to get around an individual binding arbitration agreement is to form a frickin' union, right? Like that is the way right now. So there's an interesting thing with that decision that's super dangerous. But boy, if I was, not thrown out of one of them, but if I was like in a national union, I would be like, this is let's go gonzo, right? Like the only way to, be able to do anything effective is to not have an individual binding arbitration agreement that would make women who find out their boss has been a horrible person to all of them have to individually pay for someone to go to arbitration. Like, this is insanity, and this is the United States on right-wing steroids. So, and then Janus is coming. Most people know more about that one. I don't think that's the end of labor. I think that West Virginia just showed us that. Massachusetts Nurse Association, whose members have been paying their dues without the boss involved at all since 2001. Is another great example of how it's very possible to have a union. Now, we don't like any of the cases. They're just bad. And when the right wing is introducing it, it's just bad. There's nothing good about it. But and then the executive orders were really damning. So if people missed that, let me just give you the cheat sheet of all horrible things last week. If you're a federal government worker, there's 2 million federal government workers in the United States, who work directly for Donald Trump. And there were 2 executive orders signed, at 5 minutes to 5 last Friday. A week ago Friday. like, they're smart. The Trump administration issues all these weird things like late on a Friday to like miss the news cycle. By the way, late on a Friday going into Memorial Day weekend. So many people sort of miss them. The first executive order essentially takes away what's called official time if you're in the public sector, sometimes in the private sector, but mostly in the so-called public sector unions. You have negotiated a certain amount of time by which the union steward can represent someone. The Trump administration just didn't kill it completely, but basically killed it, like took it away from 2 million federal government workers. And it will interestingly decimate pretty much. It'll be there's a very difficult moment right now for every federal government workers union. They staffed themselves essentially using what's called lost time or official time or duty time. It's just been gutted. So they're just flat-footed, totally unprepared for this moment and in deep doo-doo, and we should all be worrying about them. Secondly, they essentially took away the right to union representation if you're being termed, which is sort of like, that's when you would want it most. So 2 brutal federal executive orders immediately affecting 2 million workers, almost went under the radar screen. Unless you're a federal worker, it didn't go under the radar screen. So there's a lot of bad things happening, and it only reinforces the idea that if you can actually figure out how is it among your brothers and sisters in the workplace you work in, that you can actually get people together in mass numbers to force something else to happen called a strike, you can actually defeat these things. That's the only thing that's going to be left for a lot of workers today is, can we actually get collective action going at a level that makes it so either the union or the employer has no choice but to negotiate in a different kind of way.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I would add, as far as the Democrats, clearly we need a workers' party in the United States. It's going to take some time to get there. I think the place where it's not going to start is like West Virginia and Arizona, and places where the Republicans are empowering the Democrats opportunistically, but also, just the fact is they generally supported the demands of the strikers, and so people are like actually enthusiastic about the Democrats in a way that they're not in like New York or California. So that's not going to start there. I think in a place like New York, or places where the Democrats have been in power and have clearly betrayed for decades, it's much easier to talk about like independent candidates. So there just needs to be a differentiated approach. As far as the question of Janice, I just piggyback off that. One thing I would say is that we're about to, the kind of conditions that you are all organizing in is about to become generalized. And so that's why I'm not religious, but thank God for West Virginia, right? Like, because
State
seriously,
militias, West Virginia had armed men backing them up. I have a friend who's a great.
Okay,
so
Hi, are you on the panel?
We need militias again.
I was actually about to say that. Thank you for bringing that up. You took the words out of my. So, what I was gonna say is those, because it shows. Imagine if West Virginia hadn't happened. The conclusion a lot of labor folks could have come to is like, we're just fucked. It's like catastrophe.
Right.
And now it's like, well, actually, there's silver linings. My impression is it's going to be one step back. It's going to be very brutal, but it could be 2 steps forward, because it could hopefully create the type of dynamic in which the old traditional ways of working, which were not working, will be challenged and abandoned. Because we should just be clear, even before Janice, labor law in this country is set up for unions to lose. That's set up. It's not a winning framework. It's a really anti-democrat. We're one of the least democratic countries as far as labor law, so it needs to be challenged. And my hope is that maybe now this is the straw that broke the camel's back, and people are like, to win, we can't go through those channels. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, I was going to say one more thing about.
Go ahead.
Sorry, that I think is not also well known. On Janice, what's interesting is everyone's been obsessed about it as a question of agency fee. The truth is, there's many more dangerous things that might happen in Janice. So I just want to put it on people's radar. Like, if it is as simple and narrow as they take away a public sector union's right to collect agency fee, that's survivable. That's like, get your shit together, start organizing. You know what I mean? Like that, we can overcome that. There is a theory, though, which I'm a lot more scared about, that's potentially coming in the Janice decision, which would be that they actually allow agency fee to continue, and they narrow the scope of what's covered under collective bargaining across the entire United States. So there's a quiet discussion going on that there's a possible, like, behind-the-scenes deal, which I think would be actually devastating. I'm far more interested in giving up agency fee and keeping the terms of what collective bargaining is. So that's one possibility. It's like we actually have to wait to see what they say in Janice to know. There's devilish people sitting around that court. You know what I mean? So I've only recently begun to hear some of the stuff, Michigas, frankly, discussions going on. And some of it's much more scary than what's been presented at public, which is simply eliminating agency fees. So there are potentially much scarier things, one. And secondly, if you read, this is like if you have insomnia. If you read the transcripts from the court hearing from Janice, so each case that's coming has been set up by a previous case, right? The right wing super smart. So Knox v. SEIU, like there's been a bunch of cases that build to set up the next dangerous case. So Knox v. There's been Harris v. Quinn, like there's been a series of decisions that create space, say, oh, it's terrible, and then that goes into place, and then they take the next thing away. If you listen to the debate that happened in the Supreme Court room on the 26th of February, which would have been the worst fucking day in history, except West Virginia was going off when Janice was being argued that day. I was like, evil, great, oh my God. So in the courtroom, the argument was essentially everything collective is illegal. So I'm more if they don't do the worst version of it right now, personally, I'm more nervous that if they do agency fee, what you have to watch for in the movement is language that's setting up a next Supreme Court case that's actually going to say collective bargaining is an infringement of First Amendment rights in America in the public sector. And they're coming after collective bargaining the way Scott Walker did. Like Wisconsin, there's a lot of missed lessons here. Like Wisconsin didn't get decimated from losing like collecting dues. Wisconsin was decimated by Act 10 because it took away the right to collective bargaining. It functionally made collective bargaining nil. So that's where the Supreme Court's going. And the sooner we have more people like Emily leading strikes in West Virginia to like challenge the establishment in ways that we need to, the better off we're going to be. But they're heading towards all collective is bad and literally building towards a ruling that's going to take away the right to collective bargaining.
I'll just add a couple of things quickly onto those comments. One, just on the strike authorization vote, it reminded me of in 1970 during the postal workers strike, which was a big national wildcat strike. Nixon's labor secretary said to the postal workers union president that the only thing worse than a wildcat strike is a wildcat that succeeds. And I think that should probably be somewhat the if you invert it a little bit, the logic of any union leader who's watching something that's basically inevitable should recognize that it's time to get on the train and give it some momentum. And on Janice, just really quickly, you know, another teachers' strike that happened really recently, it was a short one, was in Jersey City here when they were negotiating their contract. And the situation there is interesting because some of the pension requirements and how they can negotiate their raises is dependent on things that are set statewide, laws that Chris Christie passed while he was in office, but each district in New Jersey negotiates their contracts at different times. So it's really, even though their conditions are really set statewide, it's really difficult for them to mobilize at the same time about these things. And I kind of think that even though it's difficult, some of the lesson from what we've seen in the strikes, which were illegal strikes, is that unions in these situations, or rank and file workers, need to be willing to disregard the structure that's handed down to them a little bit, and be willing to take action together at the times that's not mandated for them to take action. Yeah, how about 3 more questions, and try to limit it to about 1 minute each. So you in the front, sir, in the purple shirt, and in the tan shirt with the stripes.
So at any rate, you know, you mentioned before you want people to act more and think less about it. But then you went and raised a lot of think about it. You know, in terms of taking away collective actions, right? And so what happened here basically was that you pushed progressive taxation and a number of other tactics, and that's what helped. I'm wondering if, you know, a labor movement is necessary that has a much broader vision, much more collective vision. You know, again, dealing with some forms of socialism or collective with the country, and if not, all these little things that are going on are aimed at destroying that issue. And, you know, we see in Italy or other places, you know, these potential financial things going on. We see these trade wars. So the whole scene is changing to a much larger social collective issue, and I'm asking, is this something that labor needs to do to respond to that, that ultimately gives workers and the public a greater vision? And without that, we get crushed.
Okay, first of all, I'd like to say thank you for making it very clear that all this talk of rank and fileism is all about taking the militancy that's been on display in the strikes and channeling it straight into electoralism, into ballot initiatives. And I don't buy any of this that it's not about voting for the Democrats, because the DSA is part of the Democrats. They've been celebrating Bernie Sanders, the campaign from, for over a year. So really, give me a break. When the DSA-led AFL-CIO prepared the ground for PATCO disaster, Jimmy Carter was Democratic Party president, prepared the ground for that. So the question is, why can you talk about McCarthyism, separating the unions and the left? It was the Social Democrats that were responsible for carrying out McCarthyism in the unions, driving the communists out. No?
No, it was Walter Reuther, the Social Democrats,
Right.
the UAW, head of the UAW.
And I'm Janice, So with one speaker saying this is a threat to collective bargaining, absolutely true. Another speaker saying this is silver lining. With this kind of political leadership, what kind of victories can you ever hope to win? And this is exactly the same line as in the Jacobin, that there could be silver linings in the Janice ruling. No, the attacks on
If you're not going to ask a question, we're going to move on to the next speaker.
The defeat for the union movement.
All right, do you have a question for us?
There is no way that you can build.
Question?
The question is, how do
Why
you
don't you let
fight?
her talk? There's a question.
Let's get it.
She has something she wants to say.
You
Let
can't
her
organize
talk.
a strike. You can't take the state. How do you take the state? When the ILWU organizes security guards and the SEIU organizes cops. If you can't build a party, like a revolutionary party like the Bolsheviks say, is actually wanting to lead the working class to
Okay, that's a
overthrow
good
state
question.
power,
Why don't you
then
start
how can you
with
talk
your
about
questions?
organizing to take the state?
How do we take the state? Thank you. And you would answer to how to take the state, man of attention.
I used to.
You guys have one, so. Like Bernie Sanders.
Here's my question. I've tried to figure out how to phrase it as a question, because you'll be able to tell that I have a thought on this by the question. But it's clear from the West Virginia example, and congratulations, and it stands as a great example and a great encouragement to us all. It's clear that if you hadn't figured out a way to either get rid of or do an end run around the established leadership of your unions, you wouldn't have been able to do this. But my question is there a belief that if you do that, which I agree is necessary, that in and of itself opens up the floodgates for the workers saying, that's great, that's what we needed, now we're ready to strike. In other words, were the floodgates there that people would have taken to the streets just by removing the obstacle of the problematic leadership?
Just to be clear, you're asking if people thought if we just got rid of the leadership, like that was the problem, and then we could just go on strike?
Right. Yeah, I should explain. I don't believe that you believe that.
Yeah,
I asked that question because I want to make sure that the lessons of what you've accomplished aren't oversimplified by people.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, right. I think that we have a pretty good working relationship with our unions, to be clear. But I think that, just to be honest, this strike would have never happened without this surge from below. They needed pressure from below. They would have never just called the strike. The union leadership was not going to say, well, what we're doing is not working, lobbying isn't working, asking nicely isn't working, we're gonna create this, we're gonna take on this escalated campaign that might end in a strike, and then we're gonna call one. That absolutely would have never happened. We needed the rank and file to do that. But I think that, I don't think we never really saw them as an obstacle. I think, and also part of that, one of the takeaways we got from reading Jane's book, No Shortcuts, is that we were really operating under the assumption that, as members, we are the union. And we kept saying that after we read the book. We were telling everyone that, like, you are the union, you are the union. Don't stop complaining about the union leadership. You are the union. And that was really effective, and people really caught on to that. And I think people really took it to heart, and people started operating as if they were the union, because they are. If you pay dues, you can make decisions and you can organize within the union. And that's what we did. So we weren't thinking about, and we're still not thinking about taking over the union leadership. We're thinking about working with them and being the union.
I think, if I can though, I think it's also, the question is, were workers ready to just rise up and strike the first day that like if in September you had just said, hey, let's go on strike, was everyone ready to strike? I think
Yeah.
So it's the things you outlined about all the many steps you took, organizing for the PEIA hearing, like there were so many steps that you took.
We went through the proper channels, right? I keep saying that. Like, we went through the proper channels. So we went through, we organized. We had escalated steps, and those didn't work. And then finally, the last thing was, okay, we have to strike, and we did.
And I think the interesting thing that you said pertaining to that question is that you didn't even necessarily start it thinking, like, this wasn't organizing to a strike, this was organizing to win on a very important issue, which is healthcare. And then what you began to realize was the only way to win on a really important issue was to actually go out on strike.
And we knew that it might be from the very beginning, but it wasn't necessarily. We didn't know what would happen in the future starting out.
And like part of the organization of the Facebook group being invite only, being screened, being like, if you think about structure tests in organizing, there were a lot of very interesting structure tests that were being, that were sort of coming up from below, that were letting the rank and filers understand, including then the series of one-day strikes, like things were building in a way, and there was a ton of political education going on, like educating the service workers that absolutely they could go on strike with the teachers, and beginning to make it safe for people to do that. Martin Luther King Day action, PEI hearing. So there was many months of diligent work on the ground, and in the end, it was the union leadership that actually said we should take a statewide strike vote to figure out, is this really ready? So I think the interaction was. It was the interaction between the two that actually really worked in the end to pull it off, and it was pretty brilliant. And there's a lot of challenges now. I wanted to say one thing about a comment you made at the end. I think that's just a small important point for organizing in general. The idea that in New Jersey they couldn't make it a statewide fight or anywhere else. I just need to put out there, in case you don't realize this. Again, if you're acting like the union, if you're in a state where you have collective bargaining rights, like in New Jersey, or Massachusetts, or fill in the blank, or New York, or there isn't anything preventing smart union leadership, and for me that's like Emily, but like there isn't anything preventing smart union leaders from deciding to do what's called contract lineup. So in every state in the country, they could make the decision in every single education union to have all of their contracts line up and expire at the exact same time across the state. I would put that towards an election like September, every other, whatever the election year is. I'd be running I've said this to several unions, like you can line up your contracts so that you can have West Virginia. You can create, by lining up your contracts, same thing we do with the private sector, like you begin to line up contracts so that you're creating a bigger fight all at once. So it's not inevitable at all that in all the blue states where it's very district organized, they can't just say, let's make the decision, instead of bargaining 400 little contracts all alone, all at different times, all the time. In the state of Massachusetts, let's decide that every contract's going to expire the same month, the same year, and get it rolling. Like that's just, it's totally possible. It takes organizing.
In response to the question of like obstacles and buildup, again, whenever I hear about West Virginia and being there, in some ways it was so miraculous and so amazing. It's hard in some ways for I think a lot of us to imagine replicating it, because that type of upsurge and that type of like what you explained, where everyone just wanted to go on strike, there was something special about West Virginia in that sense, which has to do with the union tradition that I think is hard to replicate. Because of that, I think that as far as like lessons to be learned, Arizona is a little bit easier to generalize, because there it took more organizing. They didn't have this just kind of, they weren't able to lean on people's memory of recent strikes. They had to go out and do that systematically. So I think part of the reason they were more organized there, they had to be. There's no conceivable way they could have gotten to the point of strike votes had they not been organized. West Virginia, I think you had the benefit of being able to lean on that in a way that most of us don't have to.
We cheated a little.
Well, it's great, you know, but
I mean,
sure,
really,
but it means
like,
that it's going to require more organizing elsewhere.
Yeah.
And then just the second question, as far as you know, like the broader vision. Yeah, I think that what are the Republicans and Democrats trying to do right now? They're trying to, insofar as they concede, make it so we're going to give some raises, but it's going to come from either cutting other social services or raising sales tax, which is really a regressive way of making the rest of the working class pay for this. That is their pivot. They're going to try to stop it, and then if they concede, it's that. And that's very smart, because then eventually they're hoping that there'll be a backlash. It's like, look, the teachers are just being greedy, right? And they're, you know, it's off the back of other working people. That is their strategy. And in the 70s, that's really what fucked us, because teachers won a lot of things, and there was a backlash because they raised property taxes, right? And so I think that the question of progressive taxation, as far as the broader vision, is the crucial question right now. Because unless we're able to say that the rich need to pay for these strikes that we're winning, then we're going to get screwed. And that's, when you talk about socialism, to me that's what it means. It's like, how do you broaden people's vision? And if we can't win for progressive taxation, honestly, I have a hard time imagining how we're going to build the strength and vision to win, like, overthrow of capitalism, which I want, but we need to build up the, you know, we need to build up the power in that direction.
Yeah, I would just add sort of onto that, that one lesson I think that socialists can take away from this is what Jane talks about as structure tests, which are incredibly important in labor organizing, but I think can be applied to political organizing as well. You know, I am sort of an ideological, I do think it's important to think about what your long-term goals, political goals are. You know, things like, what is the nature of the state under capitalism? What does that mean for your electoral organizing, right? But we do really need to do more of what Jane is talking about in terms of, you know, if leftists love to just call a general strike. And we don't bother first going to our coworkers and asking, do you want to strike? And building up, you know, actually seeing whether people are ready and willing to do that. Or we want to build an independent party, but are we actually capable of, say, getting an issue on the ballot? Are we capable of collecting enough signatures to get, you know, progressive taxation on the ballot? That will tell us how ready we are to start a new party. And so I really think that it's important to stress the political education and maturing ourselves ideologically, having a really sharp sense of what actually we're doing. But these structure tests are incredibly important if we want to achieve any of that at all.